Thank you for joining us, everybody. This is the last Crash Course for the year, which are a series of micro presentations covering various topics within game dev, design, and development. And today we have Aaron Nemoyten. I had
Yes,
it
yes,
perfectly
that's right.
earlier. Apologies. Uh, he is a creative director, very strong producer, and knows way more about game design than I do, and I am very grateful for him to pass through. Um, Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Yeah, this is really cool. I've actually always been interested in teaching stuff like this because I think it's really fun and interesting. And I had my first opportunity a few weeks ago, and I was really glad to be asked to do this as well. And I saw the list of other people that had spoken here on the YouTube page, and it's impressive company. So thank you for having me. Yeah, so first of all, feel free to ask questions at any time. I don't mind being interrupted. I will try to keep it pretty brisk. I think this probably runs up against the time limit we're setting. So yeah, let's do it. So game design, what is it? And you can too. Everyone see my screen share just before I continue?
Yes.
Okay, great. So part 0, the prologue. What does a game designer do? So game design is not about having ideas. Having ideas is a prerequisite for game design, the way that having a lot of land is a prerequisite for farming, which is to say you need it, but all the work comes afterwards. So to me, being a game designer means a few things. So it's about knowing how to critically think about games. It's about developing the ability to play a game and understand what's working and what's not. If you're enjoying something, why are you enjoying it? If you're not enjoying something, why are you not enjoying it? Just as with other forms of entertainment, media, film, music, writing, there's usually no objectively good or bad game design, but there is game design that is more or less effective at accomplishing certain goals. And then after that, it's all subjective. So also, it's about developing the ability to think about the second and third order effects of decisions. So if we make the decision X, then therefore Y, therefore Z, etc. I came up with a really basic example, like Mario jumps on enemies to kill them. Okay, therefore Mario's going to be jumping a lot. Therefore, areas and levels with enemies need to have enough headroom to jump over them. Areas and levels with less headroom will be extra challenging to get over the enemies, position yourself properly. If we want to have enemies that cannot be jumped on, it needs to be very obvious they cannot be jumped on. The player should know that. Players need some degree of air control so they can target enemies when they're falling. And air control can be horizontal and vertical. And early Mario games even do have both of these. And if players have air control, then actually that means that we can have more difficult platforming challenges. And to think through this the opposite way, if you just say the main verb is going to be shooting enemies instead of jumping on them, but the player can jump anyway, then you end up with something like Mega Man, where the control is much more rigid because it doesn't need to be more fluid or expressive. I also want to mention there are lots of different types of game designers. So the larger the team gets, the larger the game gets, the more specialized everybody on the team becomes, game design included. So I just listed some here: combat, encounter, quest, narrative, level, camera, technical, systems, monetization. There's probably more I'm forgetting. Some of these are interesting cases. A technical designer is going to do a lot of programming. A monetization designer is something that not all games need. But there are a lot of games that probably need this that don't have one. So it's important, if you're going to have a game that has any kind of microtransactions, that you actually really understand in depth how games that are successful with microtransactions work, instead of just like grabbing stuff from one game or another and slapping it in. I'm sure many of you have seen examples where that happened. Narrative designer is a relatively new thing that game developers kind of figured out they needed, because figuring out how the story needs to be presented to the player, how everything fits together, is really important. And a lot of games have done this poorly, even when they had huge production design. So all of these are different disciplines that are thinking about design from the perspective of different parts of the game. Even if you're not going to be a game designer, if you're going to work in games, it's important to learn some fundamentals of game design so you know how your work fits into the game. And conversely, game designers should probably learn some about art, sound, programming, everything you can. Having cross-discipline knowledge helps a lot when you're working in a team. You're going to be doing a lot of communication, and for people in one discipline to talk to people in another discipline, being able to speak their language will save everybody a lot of time and make it much easier to iterate on ideas and um, not have to go back and forth too much because it was, oh, that's not what I meant. Here's a link to a YouTube playlist with some of my favorite game design videos. Some of these are very short and concise, like the ones from Game Maker's Toolkit, which many of you have probably seen. Some are long, silly, weird, opinionated. They're not professional game designers for the most part, but they're entertaining and they're good analysis, so they're worth watching. So part 1, the experience. Here's the game, and it's kind of a trick question. The game is not what is happening on the screen. It's not what is coming out of the speakers or the controller vibrating in your hands or your phone. The game is the experience that players are having in their head. How did they feel? What are they thinking about? What are their goals? Why are they playing this game? So are they trying to unwind? Do they want competition? Do they want to win? Etc. So one way to think about game design is through the lens of communication. So communication is not about what I say, it's about what you hear. But it's asynchronous communication. So I'm not going to be around to answer questions if you're confused about what you heard. So games are built with expectations about what the audience already does and does not know or think. And it's important to keep this in mind. So what are your assumptions when you're building a game? And what assumptions should you question that the player may or may not have as well? Like, which buttons do I push? Which direction should my character be going? Are they going left, right, up, down? Is the glowing thing good? Is it bad? Are the spiky things good or bad? Can I walk or swim in the green goo? Now, if you've played games your entire life, you know the answers to all of these questions. You know, players move from left to right. Green goo is bad. Spikes are bad. Glowing things are good. But games have an increasingly expanding audience, and it's important to keep in mind that people don't always know these things right off the bat. So it's good to try to find ways to make things that are obvious to you as obvious to other people that may not have the same knowledge base. Expanding even further, since everything in the game is about communicating to the player, that means that everything in the game is actually game design. So art is game design, sound is game design, music is game design. This is why everyone needs to be on the same page about design intent and why communication is so important. I'm going to give an example here to drive this point home. So in Doom 2016, which I hope many of you have played because it's really fun, monster sounds alert you to their presence and more or less their location. Their size and appearance communicates their threat level, their purpose, whether they're melee or ranged attackers, what their current state is, what direction they're facing, whether they're ready for a glory kill. Which I put this picture of here because this is an area where everything in the game works together to tell you something about the state of the game. So when an enemy in Doom is ready for a glory kill, which is an instant kill animation if you haven't played it, that will give you health, they will glow in this way that pulls them sort of into the UI in a way that nothing else in the game does. And it calls out to you very clearly that, like, this monster's ready. You should run up to them and hit this button. And this is an area where everything in the game is working together to tell you something about the game. Also, the monster will play like a staggered animation, and they'll be standing still in one place. All this stuff works together. And this is all game design, because game design is about communicating what's going on in the game to the player and stuff like that. Also, in this game, music changes to announce when encounters start and end. So you go from atmospheric music to really awesome music. And when you kill all the enemies in an area, the music plays sort of like a fanfare and then ends. So you know, like, yes, decisively, I killed everything. Pickups glow, the UI communicates health and ammo. All this stuff works together to communicate about the game. Okay. Is this talk ever going to get around to teaching me how to design a game? So let's talk about ideation. Where do game ideas come from? I like to think of this specifically in this way. So there are 3 different starting points for game ideas, broadly speaking. So you can start with mechanics, like a game where the player has to fit different shapes together to form a solid horizontal line. Anyone wants to turn off their mic and do the audience participation part here. You can tell me what game this is, or not, because I didn't prepare you for this. But a game where and that's Tetris, obviously. A game where the player can roll a sticky ball around that picks things up and gets bigger. What game is this?
Is it like one of the snowman game?
It's Katamari.
It is technically. It's Katamari. Yeah, yeah.
Oh.
But this is what making a snowman is. So there's that. Starting point premise: a game where the player builds and runs a theme park.
Roller Coaster Tycoon.
Yeah. A game where the player does amazing, impossible parkour like a badass. This could be a few games. What comes to mind?
Prince of Persia.
Could be Prince of Persia. Could be Mirror's Edge. It could be a lot of things.
I
Starting
think I
point
get that.
story. A game where the player accidentally time travels to the past. Their best friend gets mistaken for a princess. They break the timeline. They have to fix the timeline. They discover a world-ending threat. Travel to the distant past, a post-apocalyptic future, the end of time. Meet a robot, a frog. What game is this?
Chrono Trigger.
Yes. Okay. If nobody knew that, it would have been really sad. So these are all different ways in to figuring out what kind of game you're making. So mechanics, premise, and story are all equally valid ways to approach game design. It's really up to you and how you think and how you work. When you think about games, do you think about the stories you want to tell, about the mechanics you want to explore, about the premises you want to play out? And premise, I would also include the sort of general, like, it's a power fantasy as part of that. Ultimately, most games do need all three, unless they're sort of just pure mechanics like Tetris or just an interactive story, which I don't mean to impugn that as being lesser, but generally you have all three of these things working together and you have to figure them out together. So the three elements interact with each other and they ideally find some kind of equilibrium. So Portal's premise and story, for example, were built to give context to the mechanics. It was originally a student game that had all the mechanics, but was wrapped in a very different aesthetic and story. And when that team got snapped up by Valve to make Portal, they spent a lot of time figuring out how to wrap the mechanics up in a story and in aesthetics that would make it less jarring to communicate those mechanics. Also consider, God of War's Kratos can't dispatch enemies by jumping on their heads like Mario, because that would feel weird. Story-driven games might have a core gameplay mechanic, but add mini games to support the story. Night of the Woods is a great example of this. Chrono Trigger does this too, actually. So it's an experience, right? So mechanics, story, premise, aesthetics, and tone will all come together to form a cohesive experience. So consider thought experiments here. Could you make Uno gritty? Would Dark Souls work with a lighter tone? Consider Doom and Chex Quest are the same game engine and mechanics, and yet one of them is a timeless classic, and the other one came in cereal boxes. Or think about mechanics like a super tough co-op roguelike with randomized items and randomized levels. But actually, I'm thinking about Toe Jam and Earl, which is a very silly game. So sometimes it is possible to take mechanics that are usually considered for like dark and gritty games and repackage them in a way that makes a completely different experience. Katamari Damacy and Baba Is You are great examples of like everything coming together perfectly in a uniquely video game. And I wanted to call those out specifically instead of going in the direction of like cinematic games, for instance, Uncharted, because even though that's an example where all these things come together really well, it's not uniquely video gamey in a lot of those things. So if I asked about mechanics, story, premise, aesthetics, and tone, the answer to all of those for those games could just be Indiana Jones, and it would be the right answer. And I think for the sake of learning about game design, that's probably not the best way in. And okay, we're pretty good on time. So part 3, execution. I have an idea. Now what do I do? So the old way, and I think this is when the games industry started getting big, and team sizes started getting big and games started getting more ambitious. The old way that people were taught was to write like a 100-page game design document, GDD, that describes everything in the game from start to finish, and then just start building it. Don't do this. Just don't do this. And if you go to a game design school and someone tells you to do this, this is how you can tell they haven't worked in the industry in 20 years. So game design is not about transferring a fully formed idea from your brain to the computer. You don't need to know everything about your game to start working on it. Even if you do write 100 pages about it, most of them are probably going to be wrong, but you won't know until you start building it or playtesting it. You watch a lot of classic game postmortem talks from GDC, you'll notice that the theme is often, we started with X, here are the things that didn't work, we had to throw them out, we ended up with Y, etc. So this always happens. If you're new to game development, try to start small and simple. Here are some examples of games with simple core loops. We'll talk about a core loop in a second. If you're not familiar with any of these and or have questions, let me know. But these all have relatively simple gameplay. Gone Home just has a lot of content. Doki Doki Literature Club has a lot of content, but the core gameplay is very simple. So you have an idea. What do you do? Start with a high-level vision. If you can distill it to one sentence, you're doing really, really well. This is actually really hard to do. So I came up with some really simple examples. Golf Shooter is a game where players play golf by shooting the ball. Mechanics. The game is called Designer Brand Kids Clothing Store Simulator. So there's a premise. I tried to come up with the dumbest thing possible for a simulator game, and the answer I came up with was for some reason running a Gap Kids store. I don't know why. Or starting with story, depressed dad tells the story of a dad who, while depressed, falls down a mine shaft and must climb his way out while fighting monsters. Along the way, he learns to find strength, etc., etc., etc. That's another way to do it. So then you define the core loop. So the core loop is the single smallest possible complete unit of gameplay. You could define this as an actual loop where it ends in and then repeat, or you could just think of it as the very basic actions the player takes when playing the game. So, for example, moving and shooting, running and jumping, reading and choosing dialogue options, drawing a card, playing a card, building stuff, and collecting resources. And these are all the core loop actions of different genres. For some types of games, defining the core loop is easy. For others, maybe not. But even if defining it is easy, the next step is a lot of work, which is you have to build and iterate on it. So what does iterate mean? You build your core loop, play it, and or ask other people to play it for you, and observe quietly, as quietly as you can, without jumping in and saying, no, you're supposed to do this. Evaluate what works and what doesn't. Test various ideas for how to improve or perfect the core loop. And I will say being honest about what's not working is probably a more useful skill than even coming up with ideas, because it's very easy to be determined that an idea should work and waste a lot of time trying to make it work when you really should just be honest with yourself that maybe you should just try something else. And many people smarter and wiser than myself have gone down this path by accident and wasted a lot of time and then come back out and went, oh no, what was I thinking? For some games, you may be able to test your game without even using a computer. This is called a paper prototype. If your game is similar to a board game or a card game, definitely try to build it as one first, even if the mechanics are going to be really tedious with physical media. So for something like Hearthstone, for example, there are a lot of cards that generate more cards and do other things that are, there's a reason they didn't do those in Magic the Gathering. It's good to try to test it anyway with paper prototypes, even though you're going to do a lot of weird stuff like, oh, I have to make a new card now on this index card because we ran out of whatevers. Try it anyway, because that's still faster than programming it. So start with the tightest possible version of a core loop and then iterate outwards for each piece you get right. And this is something that in the previous talk, I had some students come back and say, well, the core loop of Halo is that you fight through a bunch of enemies and then complete an objective and then start over. And I had to say, whoa. We need to start much smaller than that. If you're going to perfect your core loop, you actually want to start with movement, and then movement and shooting, then movement and shooting and jumping, and then maybe add one enemy type. You have to start that small, because if you try to slap everything together at once, you're going to have way too many variables to try to control for while you're trying to get everything right. And if you've got enemies running around and you're shooting them, but the movement doesn't feel good, then you've kind of already messed up.
Would movement and jumping be two different things?
Movement as in, forward, backward, left, right. How does, how does inertia work? How does momentum work? Can you stop on a dime? Those sorts of things. And you're right, movement and jumping are kind of the same thing. But I would consider that, Doom's the original Doom's an entire first-person shooter, has incredible movement and no jumping, and so you can kind of do it that way.
Yeah.
Also, something like
I,
Halo. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just adding that, yeah, I look at it the same way as well. Movement separate from the jumping. It's a good habit.
Yeah, well, and also because jumping might accomplish different things. Like in the original Quake, you had the little hop, and in Halo, you've got really low gravity, so your jump is really, really high and floaty. And I think both of those affect the game in very different ways. But you have to figure out what's your base move speed before you figure out how the jump is going to work, because those interact with each other. And then I just want to mention also, if this was a third-person shooter, you have to get the camera to work properly for each of those steps. So that's a whole extra layer of complexity. If your game has jumping, build a level with different kinds of jumps, especially if that's core to your game. If your game has collectible card game mechanics, make the cards, but make the basic cards first. Figure out what the very basic mechanics are and make those fun. Test constantly, give it to your friends, give it to your family. You will know you're ready for the next step when they don't want to stop playing your game. You won't always get to that point, but it's a good metric to try to shoot for. Mario 64 is a great example of this. The game just started out as one big room for Mario to run and jump in. And I included some links about this with interviews with the developers. They spent months just messing with the camera, messing with the animations. There's a reason Mario 64 is really, really fun compared to its contemporaries that tried to jump into 3D and didn't really get any of that stuff right. I want to mention there are a lot of games where iterating on the core loop doesn't necessarily work like this. If you're writing interactive fiction, you kind of already know how it works, but there's always more to iterate on. So what's a good readable font? Should there be music? Should the text fade in? Should it type in? Do you need sound effects? How much reading should there be between choices? What does the UI look like? There's always decisions to make. So remember, you can do anything, you can change anything. What makes your game fun and interesting out of all possible decisions you can make? And it looks like I actually do have time for this last section, which is a few specific notes about game design for different types of games and different elements. So I'll go over this quickly, and then we can just do discussion. So when designing levels, areas, rooms, etc., it's good to begin at a high level and then incrementally add detail once the high-level version works. This is called white box level design. I linked to an article about it, sort of explains it in a little bit more detail. But high-level goals like this is a sewer level or tight corridors or big open areas is going to help to guide you along. And then if there's a story, if there's a specific flow that you want, write it down as a flow chart. The player, their ship crash landed, and then they see the first enemy, and then they learn this thing, and they learn this thing, and they see this, etc. And that'll tell you what each part of the level needs to do from an experience perspective. Try to draft an initial design on paper, play through it in your head, and only then, once you've done all of those things, should you build it in engine with 2D or 3D tools. Try to do it with no textures and as few details as you can get away with, because you're going to be changing it a lot. And the more detail you put into it, the more work it is to change it. Here's an awesome example on Twitter. One of the designers from Dishonored posted this. They included their flowcharts for the level in Dishonored. I can't remember the name of the level, but it's I'll try not to spoil it. There's a point at which your character, other characters think your character is dead, and you get thrown on a boat and dropped off in a specific area, and stuff happens after that. Really changes the game. This is for that section, and it shows the early ideas and how it was diagrammed out as flowcharts. And if you've played the game, it's really interesting to think about how this turned into the concrete gameplay. For systems-driven design, like simulations, idle games, turn-based games, spreadsheets are your friend. Any game with experience, levels, hit points, weapons with different damage, currencies, buying and selling, economies, all of that requires spreadsheet skills. Try to model the game in a spreadsheet as much as possible before you actually build it. Learn the useful functions in Excel and Google Sheets. They're mostly the same between them, although Sheets has some really interesting, useful ones that Excel doesn't. So it has other limitations as well. VLOOKUP, for instance, will save your bacon. That's for grabbing values from a table. Yes, learn that stuff. Very important, very useful. A lot of game design is spreadsheets. For story-driven gameplay, You need to be very, very organized. Text is very difficult to organize when it gets interactive. There's a writer on the team, work as closely as possible with them as early as possible to figure out how you're going to tell your story in a way that works well with the interaction in the game. The game industry figured this out only recently. This is the narrative designer thing that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. For my random notes, that's a presentation. Talk.
All right. Thank you so much for that presentation. We're just going to give everyone officially the floor to talk. You can put your questions to Aaron directly, or if you feel uncomfortable speaking out, you can post it in the Crash Course chat thread. All right.
I have a question. Basically, as a programmer for a game or something like this, would I need to? Well, I remember you said that even though I am not in game design, I should have some of this knowledge. So, say I don't have a game designer, it's just me, solo programmer. I don't have to depend on a game designer now. I should be able to use some of this knowledge and my own features when planning my games instead of just diving straight into programming it. That's what you're saying here.
Yeah, definitely. So I will say it depends on what your goals are. So if you are making games for fun, if you're making games to learn, and you just want to do it as an exercise for yourself as a programmer, it is fine to just dive in and start messing around because you can start, figuring out what's fun to do and what works. And if it's purely for hobby, like that's all good. But if you go like, okay, I have a game in my mind that I want to make. I want a lot of people to play it and enjoy it. I want to make money off of it, anything like that. It is good to take a step back and, try to stay away from the computer and stay away from programming as much as you can when you first start out. And, write your high level goals, write about what you want from the experience. Another thing to do if you're truly solo is to also figure out stuff about art and, figure out what your reference material is and, try to start planning it. And then once you have an idea, like what's the theme of the game? Is there a story? Is there a premise? What's the core loop going to be? And start working on the programming side of it because you'll have a much clearer idea of where you're going. And I will say, like, I'm a programmer as well, and it is very tempting to just dive in and start making stuff because it's fun. Like being productive as a programmer is really fun. But it is important to try to plan stuff in advance because otherwise you sort of end up going down holes as a programmer where you build something out like to a much higher level of fidelity than you actually need to like prove that the core loop works, and then realize you need to like change something really early in the process. So it's using that kind of process is really about being efficient with your time and trying to avoid making specific mistakes. So if you're doing it at a total hobbyist for fun level and you just want the experience, then like that's not quite so important. But if you have, goals and a schedule and you want to commercialize something, then like it is good to try to be efficient about it.
Okay, does this also apply mid development? Because as you say, sometimes you need to take a step away from things. I remember that during development, sometimes I spend like 2 or 3 days just planning something, writing something down, creating a Trello list, and just doing it structurally in my head. And then after like 3 days of that, then I'll come at the computer and just go at it and be able to get everything working. So is that also included in the planning process, or is it like before you begin programming?
I mean, it should always be an iterative process. Like, whenever you're going to sit down and just start working on something, like it's good to have a plan, but that plan is not going to get you through the whole project. That plan is going to get you to the next step. So it's like, plan, okay, how am I going to build my core loop? What's the bare minimum I need to be able to confidently put this in front of someone to test and say, like, okay, you should be able to have fun with this. And like that's kind of the end right there, right? That's your sort of development loop. And then once you're there, it's like, okay, take notes, figure out what the next step is, do some planning, then start building, then, take that back to someone to play test or just play test it with yourself and go again. Throughout development, that should be a continued thing. And even at like on the biggest project that I've worked on, which was Star Wars Galaxy of Heroes, um, I think we had 2 week sprints, and at the end of every sprint, everybody got a copy of the game on their phone, and they sat down and played it, for like an hour on a Friday afternoon, and people wrote down their feedback. We'd, towards the end of development, we'd write a bunch of stuff on a whiteboard that was like, here's the most important stuff. And then Monday morning, everyone would come in and go like, okay, how are we going to solve this problem? What's next? Et cetera, et cetera. Do a lot of planning. Game designers design, programmers estimate. Like, you have to continue having a process for all of development.
Okay, thank you.
So I am watching the crash course chat. Is that where I should be for questions?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm ready for questions. Oh, also, for the list of videos that I linked. So when I presented this before, it was for an actual class, and there was a question: is any of that required viewing? And my recommendation, if you want to get into that video playlist, is the first 5 videos are probably the best primer, and everything else is just, watch what you're interested in. But the first 5 videos in that presentation, I think, are really good, specifically about getting into game design. How can someone skill up materially as a game designer enough to secure an entry-level position? Whew, that's a tough one, because I think there's general advice that I've seen go around, but it's, depending on where you're applying to, the answers might actually be different. But my recommendation would be, it's not as much about building the skill as much as it is about how you present it. So, for a game design portfolio, I think, so having, interviewed and hired some entry-level game designers and seen a lot of these, I'd want to see more than one game. It's good to see stuff that was done in some context where it wasn't required. And I realize that's not an option for everybody, but, for people that went to game design schools, having a bunch of course projects listed is cool. But if there's anything that's like, and I made this for fun, that's also nice. But in your game design portfolio, it's good to be able to show details about what you did. So a list of games is a bare minimum. Screenshots are helpful. What's really nice is any kind of concrete demonstration of exactly what was done. Like, what did you do? How did it contribute to the game? What was your thought process? So once you once you get to the point where you're like, yes, I have made game, or I've worked on someone else's game, you should be able to explain the decisions that you made and how that led to a better game. Like, what was the challenge that I had to overcome? What was the the prompt for this part of the game or this system or whatever, etc. And like, how did you accomplish that? If it's level design, like, include some diagrams and what was the flow and show the step by step. Like, for hiring game designers, it's important to show that you can reason about game design, because there are a million people that want to be game designers who think that game design is just being like, it would be really cool if there was a game like this. Like, that's not game design. That's just coming up with an idea. Did I answer that enough? I want to see if there's any follow-ups to that before I move on to the next question. All right. I will move on to Graham's question. Are spreadsheets necessary for all games? No, they're not. Yeah, no. You don't need spreadsheets for, a game that's like pure action or mechanics. Spreadsheets are good for any game with what you would call system design dealing with numbers. So, yeah, inventory, stats, economies, stuff like that. But once you get to the point where if you have that stuff in your game, like, you want a spreadsheet, even to the point where if you have, let's say you have damage that scales and enemies that have hit points, right there, you need a spreadsheet, because you need to make sure that, like, the number of hits to kill an enemy is scaling up the way you want it to. So if you increase your difficulty from it takes 3 hits to kill an enemy, and you want it to be it takes 10 hits to kill an enemy, but you accidentally increase their HP too much and you end up with it takes 200 hits to kill the enemy. You want to know that in the spreadsheet, not when you go to test it in the game. That's more efficient. I do want to mention this doesn't necessarily mean advanced math, because a lot of the stuff I'm talking about is literally just like multiplication, addition, subtraction, stuff like that. It's, how many hits does it take to kill the monster is just how much HP does the monster have divided by how powerful is the weapon. Simple stuff. But being able to view that in a spreadsheet, like visually, is way more efficient than any other way to do it. How do you tie things to spreadsheets? Because yes, great question. So there are a lot of different ways to do this. I've seen the actual fanciest way is I saw someone build a plugin that actually took your Google Sheets credentials and a URL for a document and would like let you push a button in Unity and automatically import data into the game. That's seems a little bit overkill. I've done something as simple as I wrote a TSV reader / stole code from Stack Overflow and just export from my Google Sheets to TSV every time I make a change. It's super easy. You have to write manually that's like, split by tabs and then go like, okay, column 0 is this property of this object. Column 1 is this property of this object, et cetera, and like manually convert to whatever the data type is. But like, that's a really easy way to do that. You can get much more complicated. Programmatically, you can do anything you want. You can read stuff from a database, which if you're making a live service game is kind of like a really important thing to do. You can read stuff from scriptable objects in Unity. I don't know what the equivalent is in Unreal or, Godot or whatever, but, there's all kinds of ways to do it. But like TSV and CSV importers are probably the absolute easiest way to do it if you just want something like quick and dirty. You probably don't need databases unless you're building a live surface game where you have a lot of stuff you need to update frequently. Oh yeah. Scriptable objects also, they're kind of poorly named. They're basically just data. It's data objects that live like on disk in Unity rather than in prefabs. And so when you change them on disk, they are changed, as opposed to if you change a prefab in a scene, you have to like save it or apply it or whatever. How nifty does it get when you want to bring AI into your core? What does nifty mean in this context? Please explain this question. Tedious. AI is hard. There are some things that will help you. So Unity has a thing called nav mesh. I've only used Unity, not Unreal, so I'm sure there's equivalents elsewhere. But like if you have a 3D game and you want pathfinding, just follow a nav mesh tutorial and you will get pathfinding for enemies. And then, there's a lot of research to do about how exactly to make that stuff work the way you'd want it to. But at the basic level, you can just have, enemy wakes up when user gets close or makes a sound. Enemy gets close to user, when they reach a certain distance, start shooting them. Simple stuff like that. Portfolios. If I'm presenting one to a recruiter but have more than one skill in game dev, should I merge 2 areas in game dev into one portfolio? Ooh. I've seen people with portfolio websites who just separate them into different pages. I wouldn't mash them together into the same place necessarily, especially because if I'm hiring for one position, I want to know you are good in that one position. And if you try to pitch yourself as being a jack of all trades, then I am suspicious that you are not great at anything or not dedicated to any of those things individually. If this is for a really small studio where you need people to wear multiple hats, then like, yeah, you can pitch that. But if you're going for anywhere that needs specialized people, which is anything over like, I don't know, 10, 20, they need people to be really specialized and dedicated to one thing. So try to present the portfolio for the area that they're hiring you for. And if it's just a general thing, then like just make it clear that like, hey, I have 2 different portfolios, check them both out. Um, breaking them into simple mechanics to make AI seem smarter. Yeah, yeah. Um, that's how to do it. There's a lot of stuff written about AI and a lot of GDC talks because that's an area where I think um, a lot of research has been done. And there's a lot of really advanced AI stuff you can do, and there's a lot of really simple AI stuff you can do that seems advanced to the player. So don't underestimate the power of duct tape. Showing prototypes to friends or random strangers or other developers. Yeah, okay. So biased isn't necessarily the word that I use, is so much as people approach things from a different perspective. And it's important to know who you trust to give you good feedback. Um, so other developers might give some really specific feedback that can be useful in some ways, but also might get too clinical in the sense that like your friends might just be like, "Oh yeah, this is really fun," or like, "I'm not having fun," and you can decide how your vision determines the response. So the thing about showing to random people who are not developers is that they often try to tell you how to solve the problem. And if someone says, this is an important thing to learn, if someone says I'm not having fun, they're right. They're not having fun. If they tell you how to fix that, they're probably wrong. And it's just really important to try to respect when people are not enjoying the game and go like, okay, there's something wrong here. I need to figure out how to fix it. Try to ask them questions about what their expectations were. What did you want to happen? What did you expect? But don't necessarily listen to their suggestions about how to fix it. And I wrote an example about this in some essay that I wrote at some point, but the analogy I came up with was like, if you go to a restaurant or if you see a review for a restaurant that says this food is too expensive, the problem might not be that the food is too expensive. The problem might just be that people's expectations were wrong. And maybe like having a big laminated menu with colorful drawings on it made them think the food should have been cheaper. So potentially you could do nothing besides redesigning the menu and making it look really fancy and using serif fonts and having it on like, embossed, thick paper. And they will say, "Oh, that was great," and the food was correctly priced because their expectations were set by the menu. I see a lot of typing, but I'm waiting for more questions. You're welcome. But yeah, show prototypes to people you can trust first, and then once you have something that's more fleshed out, expand to a larger audience. If you have a group like this one, this is actually a great context because you have a whole lot of people who are part of your community who want to see you and your community succeed, and it gives you a bigger audience of people who are not necessarily like hardcore developers, but want to give you good feedback. Yes, there's a feedback channel. That's what these are for. But it is for early in the process, I will say, if you can get someone to play who's like, in your house, someone in your family or your housemates or friends or whatever, and you can like literally just stand behind them and watch them play, that's the best place to start. Using a prototype with just simple objects, but tight mechanics, good to add to my portfolio. Yes, absolutely. To show that you can do that. If you prototype something, and it also to say like, here's my goal. Like I wanted to X. I'll prove this out by building the following mechanics. Here's what I learned. Here's what worked. Here's what didn't work. I decided not to make this into a full game, or this was just to build a prototype. Like be clear about your thought process at all times. Just realized I probably should be reading these questions since there is video of this, so I apologize for that. I'm trying to make it clear, but that question was for making a game design portfolio. What about showing prototypes that just have simple objects, basic graphics, but tight mechanics? Is that good for a portfolio as well? And my answer is yes, as long as you explain what's going on. Also, you don't necessarily need to link to playable builds because actually playing a build is a big time sink for someone who's reading those portfolios. So if you can have the concise explanation and diagrams and or a video, and the video is short, like a minute or two, that's probably the ideal case. I didn't even see the question about the video before I started talking about that. Having a video with breakdowns in it, is that good to include for ease of access? Yes. Try not to ask people to download a build. If you can put up something that's web playable where they can get the gist of it in like a minute, that's useful. But if it's like, I made this thing and it's a 300 megabyte download and you have to be in Windows or, Mac OS or whatever, that's probably too much work for someone that has 200 applications to get through. HTML5, yes. Put it on itch.io as HTML5 and everyone's happy. Just be careful if it requires full screen and like mouse look, because that gets weird. You're welcome.
I have a question.
Sure.
So when it comes to like jobs that require portfolios, I would mainly hear a lot of persons would say that that you don't really need to, like, you don't really, okay, when people think that they're not ready because, like, they're the stuff that they don't have, like they don't think it would be enough. A lot of persons will say that it is enough because you're just going to end up learning more while you're at the job. So I'm wondering if like that also applies to like creating portfolios to like for game design, and like what's the amount of effort that you have to put into it so that say, okay, then this will get me in. Hopefully
It's hard
that's
to, yeah, it's hard to say, because I think different people are looking for different things. I will say though, from my perspective, it's somewhat defined by what your competition is going to be doing. So, I hired a part-time game designer, like 6 months ago, I think, and there were a lot of people that had portfolios from game design schools where they had completed, let's say, 3 or 4 projects. They had screenshots from them, descriptions of what they did in those projects. They're often across different genres, solving different problems. And a few of those people had some, sort of intern level experience at established companies as well. So, spend the time to put together your portfolio to show what you have done as well as you can. With all the explanations, with video if you can, with playables if you can, screenshots, diagrams, stuff like that. But if you don't get a bite on at that level, just keep adding stuff, I guess, and put put the best, most recent stuff at the top so that you're always giving yourself the best shot with people who are just skimming. I don't think there's a minimum. It's it's all just based on who else is applying and the standards of whoever the hiring manager is and stuff. So, the goal isn't necessarily to have the most stuff that you've worked on, but it is to have stuff that shows the skills that they're looking for in particular, or the interests that they're looking for, and that explains how you got there. Also mention that if you have a specific interest in or experience in the type of game that you'd be working on for what you're applying for, that does help. So, if you're applying to somewhere that makes very narrative heavy games and you've got like a bunch of Twine games on your itch.io page, and they can just go play one real quick, like that is going to be way more useful than if they're looking for people with narrative game experience and you've got, a bunch of like platformers. Is it possible to get an internship without going through a university? So I think that depends on a lot of things. It unfortunately depends on where you are. So different places have different rules and laws about what internships can and cannot be. I think that unpaid internships are like so I'm in California, and I think unpaid internships are no longer legal. unless you're getting course credit, like unless they actually count as part of your course credit. Could be wrong about that, but there used to be a lot of unpaid internships in a lot of creative industries, and there's been a lot of cracking down on that because of a huge number of problems that it creates, where people that have to work to pay their way through college just can't do them, and so that favors people that already they come from backgrounds where they already have money or they have some kind of cushion. So I don't know. The rules are constantly changing in regards to internship, and so I wouldn't specifically shoot for internship. If you have experience, if you have a portfolio, if you've built stuff, just go straight to applying. Because you know, when I posted a job posting for this recently, like I saw a lot more people with game design degrees than I would have a few years ago because there's just more people getting them. But you don't have to have one, and I saw um, portfolios from people that had degrees in other things that were also doing game design, and that's fine too. Um, if you do not have a degree, then you really have to make up for that with experience. And like experience does kind of like rule all. So if you've, somehow made something really amazing, and you just like didn't go to college, but you made an amazing game anyway, then like I'll look at that portfolio. I hope that answered the question sufficiently. Looks like it did. I think we've got time for one or two more questions before we hit the top of the hour. So get them in now. It's interesting that these are mostly about career stuff and not about game design. Does anyone have any game design questions? Yeah, I know it's an issue of market, and a lot of people are just trying to get into the industry. It's tough, I know.
Okay, so I have one. It's not fully structured, but I'm gonna structure it while I ask. So it
Okay.
is it is when it comes to explaining concepts, like you're working in a small group, maybe for a game jam. As a programmer, explaining concepts for designing, what are some things that you would say, when explaining this to somebody else? What do you look out for? Or what should I look out to try and explain to them?
That's interesting. I think the key is to think of things, be able to think about things from the perspective of the intended experience and not the implementation. So, as a programmer, you're probably thinking in terms of implementation a lot, and saying, this happens and then this happens and this happens. But even if you want to get there eventually, I think it's really, really important to communicate, whatever the player needs to feel like this. This is the story we're telling. This is the vibe we're going for. Just the broad strokes that are sort of the squishier, more subjective stuff.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the time, if you're working with a team of people and some of them might be more experienced with art, with game design, stuff like that, if you talk in terms of your high level goals, those people can help flesh out what you need to do to accomplish those goals from a player experience perspective. And if you just start from the mechanics or you start from the implementation or something like that, start from that low level, it's going to be more difficult for people to know how to build on that. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
Awesome.
With that question, I remember you were talking more about having to plan something because you might just jump onto an idea and think it's the best thing when the user wouldn't see it as something useful or enjoyable. But my question would be in terms of the possibility of that idea being executed. What if the plan that you have, the programmer probably can't create something due to the limitations of maybe their knowledge or the tools, or maybe the artist or the composer can't achieve that. What is like how is that dealt with where the plan that you have isn't actually possible?
It's interesting because that gets into um, if everybody understands the design goals and the high level vision, you can actually back way, way, way out at that into that level and go like, okay, we can't do X, Y, and Z because, whatever, we don't have the capability, we don't have the time. We're making a 2D game that would require a 3D game. Okay, what do we do instead? And if everybody can understand the high level goals, we want the player to feel this, that sort of thing, or we want to be able to tell this story, you can start thinking, how do we accomplish those goals in other ways? And, I'm sure there's a lot of examples about this, but like, I think the classic example of working within constraints is stuff like, the Silent Hill fog thing, where it's like, we want to make a game where people are exploring a town, but our draw distance has to be really, really short because the PlayStation's hardware is garbage. Not really garbage. It's just what they had at the time. But the solution was, let's just have a lot of fog. We'll make the draw distance into an asset, and then we'll design the game around that. And there's a lot of examples of that sort of thing happening in game development where people sort of started with a high level goal and went, okay, actually, we're going to make the limitations work for us in that respect, instead of just butting our heads against it and like doing the wrong thing. And there are a lot of games. Sorry, go ahead.
I can only watch anything but it. So you're not gonna load. You can hear me.
Maybe that wasn't for me. There were a lot of games early in the 3D game time when people were trying to figure out how to make those, where they tried not to make those trade-offs and they made worse games as a result because they sort of didn't know how to sacrifice one thing to get another. Graham gave me some lightning round questions. Let me see how quickly I can answer them. How do you design a small game? What are some things to consider? Really, really tight core loop. Pick one action the player is going to do over and over again. Flappy Bird, Tiny Wings, Super Hexagon. Look at those. Those are great examples. Can you design a game that will take a certain time frame to build, testing and bug fixes aside? The short answer is no, unless you've done it before. So, there's a lot of examples of studios making a first game that was a big hit and then just making that same game over and over again, sort of, more or less, right? Sierra Online did this with King's Quest, Heroes Quest, Space Quest, Leisure Suit Larry, Police Quest, and they just made the same game over and over again with, a different content slapped onto it. Telltale tried to do this later, but they didn't do it very well, and they just crunched everyone into misery. So be careful. The short answer is no, it's really hard. The long answer is if it's a sequel or a reskin, you can do it. Are there any design trends you see popping up that we should be looking at more? That's a tough question. I would say look at what you're interested in, because that's probably going to light your fire more than just trying to follow whatever trends are happening if you're not interested in them. That being said, there's always clever stuff going on in the indie scene. I need to play Inscription. I've heard that's really amazing. I had to uninstall Slay the Spire because I was playing it too much, but that's a game with absolutely brilliant design. I think so. There's a lot of stuff happening in indie games around roguelikes and around exploring mechanics, and like squeezing as much juice out of like some simple mechanics as possible. I'm playing Dicey Dungeons right now. That's another one that does that. What's your favorite game from a design perspective? Well, my favorite game is the original Deus Ex, but that game is tough to look at from a design perspective because it just has every feature. But I love it. It's so much fun. I think though the best example of a like game designy game is probably Katamari Damacy, because it takes a single core gameplay element and fleshes it out to like an insane degree, and then it builds like a premise and aesthetic around it that's like so self-awarely goofy that I don't know, it's just ridiculously fun, and the soundtrack is amazing. How would you create something like the Unity animation timeline with the animation events, but instead the timeline would be the audio, and you have an audio? Oh my gosh, that's not for me. I can't answer that right now. That's a very specific technical question that is outside the scope. That's outside the scope of my expertise. Wait, let me think about it one more second, see if I can give you anything useful. Um, yeah, no, you're just gonna have to build that. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I don't know your name. It just says Macaroni Jam, so I'm sorry, Macaroni Jam. I have let you down. Someone
That
give me a real
seems more
final
like a
question.
programmer type thing than a design.
Yeah, that's a programming question.
Yeah.
Wait, I have
Someone give me a
a
final
Okay.
question.
Oh,
Wait, Macaroni, you wanna go?
Sure. So I noticed that because I kind of take a course in game design, you'll notice that you'll learn about some stuff that you already know before, but it's like already touched on more, and you may also learn some, game history and so on. Do you ever find yourself applying that now, or do you just go off with what you already know? I'm not sure if that's clear, yeah.
So, I mean, I think it's always good to try to learn more. There is the problem that like you can learn about game design by playing games, you can learn about game design by reading, you can learn about game design by just sitting down and trying to write down your own thoughts and flesh them out. Um, you know, like learning by teaching, for instance. Um, so it's I don't know, it's always going to be happening. Like if you're interested in learning about game design, there's always something to be learned somewhere. As far as applying it, I did read something interesting where someone said, "Look, I think a lot of game design theory is a post hoc analysis and not something that was used to actually build the game." Um, so, and I think that's true. I think most most successful games are not designed by sitting down and thinking through the theory and then trying to build a game out of that. So it definitely I think it has to be an interplay between that. If you learn the theory and just try to keep it in mind while you're building something, it will help you to move forward. Um, but a lot of it is just practice and figuring out what works for you. And like I mentioned earlier in the presentation, between story and mechanics and premise, some people think purely in terms of mechanics. Some people just want to sit down and flesh out mechanics and build a game out of that. Some people think purely in terms of the stories they want to tell. And like, you know, there are so many different design specializations. There's so many different ways to think about design. The main like textbook for game design is the Theory of Game Design, the Book of Lenses, which is like literally just 200 ways to think about game design, and they're all it's the player experience, it's the controls, it's the premise or the story or the theme or whatever. There's so many different ways to think about it that it's kind of an infinite rabbit hole if you want it to be. So, always be learning, always be thinking about it. Try to write if you can, just to get your thoughts down and figure out, how do I feel about game design? Because I think figuring out what your unique perspective is, it's what's going to help you make an interesting game. Yes, Glenn. So game design boils down to the ability to critically examine and explain the interplay of some games. I mean, I don't know that I'd say it's always systems. Elements maybe, elements of games, but it's important to be able to critically examine and explain the systems, the elements, the art, the sound, how everything comes together. It's what makes it difficult. When I said everything is game design, I do kind of mean that. And like the scarves in Journey are a character animation element that's also UI that also conveys information to the player about how much jump they have left, right? It all mashes together so much that it's hard to say what game design is. People can't even agree what a game is. And I didn't get into that in the presentation on purpose because there's no agreement on the definition of game. So yeah, elements / components / things / stuff, asterisks. Absolutely, Glenn. All right. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you, everybody. That was really fun. I appreciate the questions.
Yeah, I think we would wrap up with that. Aaron, thank you again for coming through. I think it was a very informative presentation, and I think it was an excellent way to wrap up the year. So yeah, thanks again. Guys, I've posted links at the top of the chat to the YouTube playlist as well as a copy of the presentation. Yeah, thanks.
All right. Thank you, and feel free to @ me in the chat if you have any additional follow-up questions.
All right, thanks. Bye.
All right. Bye, everybody. Have a good one.
Bye.